Hey, what's up everybody? Today let's talk about authorized user trade lines and some of the dangers of getting these type of trade lines on your credit report. The reason why I'm doing this video today is because it's one of those things that I've been looking on YouTube and some of this stuff on the internet about trade lines and their effectiveness. The biggest problem I've always had customers tell me and deal with is the idea that, hey, trade lines are the ones that are going to help you boost your credit score really fast and you don't have to worry about any other consequences, which is not true. Fact of the matter, trade lines can actually hurt your credit, especially now with the FICO 10 and the FICO 10T rolling out. So what we got to figure out is what are some of the things that you can do ethically and the right structural way in order to avoid penalties and potentially getting your score impacted in a negative way so that you don't get hurt down the road. Another thing we'll talk about is what are some of the ways that you can get access to some of these trade lines, whether it be within your own personal means or within your network, a degree or second degree away. And the biggest thing we're going to talk about also is what are some of the pitfalls of buying trade lines, especially of those that you're not aware of, and what are some of the long-term consequences with the FICO 10 and the FICO 10T model. And the reason why we're doing this video also is another one is because my channel is designed to educate you guys, to give you the best solution possible when it comes to trade lines. The problem I always have is that even with all the information that I can give you, there's a lot of issues that I've come across clients when it comes to, hey, Ali, I'm in the process of fixing my credit, but I absolutely need trade lines. So can we do something about that? And for me, that's very dangerous because, I have to guide them in a right way, but at the same time, I don't want to deceive them by allowing them to buy trade lines that are potentially going to hurt them, especially when it comes to authorized users. So let's get to the topic after this intro. So when it comes to authorized user trade lines, there are several best practices that we always have to follow. Now, it goes without saying that when it comes to trade lines, you really have to be careful with the type of trade line that you're getting, right? The reason why I say that is because, a lot of people are selling all these type of trade lines. Sometimes what happens is they take so long to post on the credit report and you're just waiting and you're spending money, right? So if there was no financial consequence behind buying trade lines, we don't have to worry about it. But the fact that you're spending money to get a trade line, you have to be careful because there's so many different factors that we'd have to look at. But generally speaking, there are benefits to adding trade lines. And that's what we're going to talk about. There's going to be 5 points. We're going to break it down. But the first point is obviously what are some of the consequences on a positive level and the financial benefits of adding trade lines to your profile. So the first one, as obvious as it sounds, is it helps you improve your credit score. It gives you a boost on your credit profile. And the way it works, right? The way it works is when you add a trade line, what you're doing is you're leveraging other people's history. That's the given. But the other thing that you have to be careful with also, which we're going to talk about in point number 2, is the dangers, is that you may have to inherit some of the trends based on their previous borrowing history and how much balances they were carrying. Were they at an all-time high with their balances compared to the limit? And all these other things that you always have to accommodate when it comes to now taking over their credit history. That means you're taking over everything that the new FICO model is going to adapt when it comes to looking at a consumer from a credit standpoint. So obviously, outside of getting a credit boost, what happens now is you're more eligible for funding, you're more eligible for a diversified credit portfolio because somebody in good faith with credit has decided to extend that credit to you. So you can take advantage of that. So that's the first point, right? So these are some of the ways that you can boost your credit, which is obviously buying a trade line or getting access to a trade line through a friend or family, which I recommend. That's the first step I recommend. The reason why is because friends and family, they're more likely to give you a trade line that you'll understand. A lot of these trade lines that you're buying out there doesn't necessarily mean you understand them, and there lies the very big risk of not knowing what are some of the future consequences of that trade line. So that's the first step, right, when it comes to family and friends. Now, let's move on to point number 2, which is what are some of the risks and dangers with authorized user trade lines today in 2020 and why you should pay attention when it comes to accessing or even buying these type of trade lines. So point number 2, what are some of the dangers of adding trade lines to your credit profile from sources that you're not aware of and you're buying from? So the first thing is, obviously, we know the FICO 10 and FICO 10T. The reason I'm emphasizing so much on this in this video and the topic is because the new FICO trends, right, when they go out and they roll out, what's going to happen is it's going to affect your credit score. The way it's going to affect your credit score is the FICO measurement is going to take into account the history of your balances at a given 24-month period. In addition to that, they're also looking at how much minimum payments you're making, whether on time, and whether you just respected the minimum or you went above and beyond the minimum payment. That's a big factor. We know that the credit utilization, as well as the minimum payment and the payment history, contributes to a very big percentage of your credit score. There's other additional benefits, obviously, such as like the type of diversified portfolio you have and so on and so forth. But those are the two biggest ones. And what happens is inherently, when you buy authorized user trade line, for example, right, and you're reaching out to those type of companies or individuals, and let's assume you buy it. When you add that profile to your credit, what ends up happening is you can inherit their bad. What I'm saying is if they carried, let's say, in the last 24 months, let's say they had a $10,000 credit card. For the sake of this example, $10,000 credit card. Let's assume they borrowed up to $9,000 for the past 22 months, for example. So you had 2 months of where the balances were really low. And what happens now is when the FICO 10T, which is the trends, which now shows the utilization was actually very high, which is bad because they were carrying a big balance. And let's assume they actually missed a payment during those 24 months. You're also going to inherit some of that trade. Now, the reason why I say that is because it's going to actually transition over to your credit profile. And it's dangerous because now what's going to happen is if the person has borrowed, so there's a lot of factors to consider. If the person has borrowed, let's say assuming close to the maxed out limit they have, which is they almost maxed out their credit card, what are some of the financial habits that can lead them to borrowing that again? In case of certain situations. No, I'm not saying that that's what's going to happen again. Situations change, and sometimes what's going to happen is they may have to tap into that credit limit because they have family emergency or circumstance like life happened. During those incidents, what's going to happen is you have to be very careful. The reason why you have to be careful is because now, without knowing, it's going to negatively impact your credit score as an authorized user. Why? It's because now they're going to max out their balance, and what's going to happen is that utilization is going to drop, and it's going to affect your overall credit score, especially if you're dependent on that authorized user to keep your credit good. So that's the dangers. And now we have to discuss the ability of financially being able to engineer your profile by buying these trade lines. When you buy these type of trade lines, and let's say you add it to your credit profile, a big issue that I've seen very frequent is the fact that you have to keep that trade line for at least 2 months. Now that means you have to pay for 2 months to maintain that credit profile, to maintain that authorized user. Does it benefit you? I don't believe so, because at the end of the day, what if within that 2 months you don't meet the underwriting requirements that you're trying to aim for? So the best time to add a trade line is really to clean up your credit, to understand, to build your own primaries, which I talk about essentials and non-essentials. Essentials are pretty much major creditors, institutions that have access to multiple variety of financial products. And the non-essential trade lines and the ones that are primaries are basically the ones that are like My Jewelers Club, Hutton Chase, New Coast Direct, and so on and so forth. So you have to start building your profile first, which we're going to talk about, right? But I'm saying you have to be careful when you're buying trade lines that you're not aware of their previous history. So point number three we're going to go on is to talk about what are some of the things and what are some of the questions that you can ask when it comes to acquiring these type of trade lines. And the reason why you want to be able to do that is because if you don't take your time to ask the right questions, you may have a potential risky trade line that you're buying that may affect you negatively if anything happens during that incident where they have to borrow again, or if their trends demonstrated that they were actually in a very high risk position, close to maxing out their limits. And you need to be aware of that, because if that's the case, then maybe it's not a good decision to buy that trade line. So let's go ahead and talk about point number 3, which is the right type of questions to ask before buying an authorized user trade line. So now we're going to talk about what are some of the questions that you need to ask when it comes to buying an authorized user trade line. See, a lot of people buy these type of trade lines because they have these services out there and they just go and tap into those and pay a certain amount of dollars and then basically have that profile added to your credit report as an authorized user. It's brilliant. It works amazing. The challenge is a lot of these people actually sold that with the context that, hey, look, don't worry about your existing debt. We're just going to modify your credit profile, add these trade lines, and you should be good to go. You got to be careful with that. You don't want to be able to position yourself in a way that that's the only thing that you're dependent on to kind of, increase your profile, because you have to work on your credit. You have to adjust the negatives. You have to modify some of the things that are holding you back, some of the inconsistencies, and so on and so forth. We're going to talk about that at a later point. But here's the things that you need to ask when it comes to buying trade lines. And the reason I say that is because it's very critical. If you don't ask these type of questions, you're positioning yourself in a very risky way, which means that you cannot afford to use a profile of somebody else that is potentially at a risk, and without you knowing it, you're adding that And on top of that, you're paying money for it, which is now going to hurt you. So let's go ahead and review some of the questions to ask. The first question you want to ask is, what were the trends during the past 24 months of that trade line? The problem with a lot of these providers who are selling trade lines online or potentially tapping into their own network about these trade lines is they don't have the credit profile history. And the reason why you want to get history is for two reasons. Number one, you want to know how the trends were in the past 24 months. Just because the FICO 10T is adopting it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't take your measures on understanding what were the history of those specific situations with that credit account. The reason why, it's because number one, it could put you at risk. What if that individual, like I said, decides to borrow or tap into that credit limit and maxes it out, and all of a sudden you have a deadbeat trade line in your credit profile that's actually hurting you more than doing you good. So you need to take the measure of asking, what were the trends in the last 24 months of that specific trade line that we're about to add? Question number 2. What's the cost of keeping that trade line for a minimum of 4 to 6 months? Not 2 months, 4 to 6 months. Because what happens is, in order to see a positive improvement in your credit profile, sometimes the credit reporting agencies play a roller coaster with your scoring model. Why? It's because certain modifications are being made in the process while other things are being adjusted. For example, negative items may be coming off, inquiries are coming on your credit report, it's hurting you, it's improving your credit, and all of a sudden you have these type of authorized users being added, it's giving you a boost, it's recalculating your score in the 4th month. So there's a lot of moving pieces, right? So you want to have that trade line for at least a period of 4 to 6 months when it comes to authorized users. That's going to actually help you. So again, let's review that. Number 1, what are the trends in the last 24 months of that authorized user trade line, and how can I get access to that? Number 2, what's the minimum amount of time frame? I want it for a minimum of 4 months to maximum 6 months. What's the structure and model to be able to achieve that? Okay, and the best way to achieve that obviously is family and friends, because they know you and then you can structure a deal with that. But let's assume you're buying these trade line services, then you have to pay more, right? And in addition, you don't even have their history, so that puts you at risk. I'm not a big advocate of that, as you can tell. And the third question, I believe, is one of the most important questions that you can ask is, do you foresee any type of long-term expenditure, or if you're going to go ahead and improve that credit profile over time? The reason why, it's because what if they have certain things that they're looking forward to spending on, and that creditor basically is allowing them this huge limit, but that individual, even though their past may be great, right, even though everything is okay, they may foresee expenses. And you can ask them that, and you have the right to ask that, because if they do foresee expenses, that means that if they actually do go above that, let's say 25 to 30% threshold in terms of limit, maybe they're not maxing it out, but they kind of go near that 50% or whatever, then the utilization is not really helping you. Do you understand? Like, you have to keep thinking about these type of things. And if it's not helping you, then it's basically in a position to hurt you. And that's why you probably don't want to add that trade line. Maybe it's not a good idea to add it right now. Maybe wait until they finish off, come back, expenses are minimalized, and then all of a sudden it's a good situation for you to add their trade line and their credit profile and their history that you can borrow and leverage in order to improve your personal credit. So those are the 3 main questions that you have to ask when it comes to buying authorized users or even accessing authorized users. Let's go over them one more time, because I just want you to be so comfortable with this. Number 1, what are some of the 24-month trends in the past about this account specifically? Was it close to being maxed out? Did you ever miss a payment, right? Did you ever get bumps on this credit limits in the past? So as you can tell, there's benefits there. The second thing you absolutely want to be able to do is, what's the structure in order to get it for a minimum of 4 to 6 months, because that's what you need. The third question is, do you foresee any expenses coming up for that account? Because I want to be able to make sure that the threshold and the limit and the balance is below the 30% utilization mark. Okay, so those are the 3 main critical questions you absolutely need to ask when it comes to getting trade lines on your profile, or even buying credit trade lines that you're going to do that in your credit profile. So that said, these are the 3 main points I wanted to cover, right? The FICO 10T, the trends, the dangers of adding trade lines, and all these type of things. With that said, I think let's talk about some of the ways that you can improve your credit even before adding trade lines, so that you can position yourself for success. Okay, so now we're at our final approach. Now we're going to talk about some of the things that you can do right away to improve your credit profile without adding the authorized user or primary non-essential trade lines in your credit profile. So the first step is obviously clean up your personal information. I advocate that so much. It's one of my favorite techniques when it comes to starting your credit repair journey. Make sure that the personal information on your credit profile is consistent with who you are, up-to-date information, and is not putting up irrelevant injurious, misleading information, because those are typically the ones that are tied to the negative accounts that we're going to remove. Okay. Number 2, make sure you remove all the stuff that is non-affiliated with you based on the personal information removal. That's what we call an item anchoring technique. Potentially, you may have dangerous negative items that are holding you back, and if that's the case, then if you anchor the personal identifiers, remove all those personal details, and challenge it with the credit reporting agencies based on that context, you have a lot higher success ratio. The reason why I say that is because it works really well, as you're challenging the entire infrastructure of the reporting because the information that was snapped or even put up there in the first place was misleading. Third point, contact your existing creditors even before touching authorized users or applying for primaries if you have them. The reason why I say that is because with the existing creditors, let's assume you tap into their resources and they give you access to credit. What's the beauty of it is that now you can start improving your utilization if they increase your limit. Now there are 2 things that can happen. Number 1, when you call them and you contact them in order to get those limits, they can actually say, hey look, right at this moment we don't have anything. However, if we pull your credit and if we find something that we can be giving you in terms of your eligibility, let's look into that. And in those situations, you want to avoid that because in a hard inquiry is going to definitely affect your credit negatively. Number 2, you can ask them if they have promotional offers based on your payment history. Typically, when you're calling a creditor, you want to have at least 6 months of positive payment. I'm not saying have at least 6 months with that creditor, right? You can have that creditor for 6 months and not have borrowed a single dollar on it and you have no payment history established. I'm talking about at least 6 months of payment history on a positive level to contact them and then asking them, hey look, can we do something about this as a promo for me because it looks like I'm keeping my balances low, I'm always paying my card on time, and I foresee spending in the future. Would you mind giving me an extension based on that alone instead of pulling my credit, as I want to preserve my credit score? And in most cases, they might say yes. If let's assume, 8 out of the 10 times they say no, what you can do is call back within a 30-day period. And you say, look, I'm going to try again. I appreciate you guys' assistance. I look forward to doing business with you. That's all it is. So those are the ways that you can improve your credit scores immediately without even touching authorized users and these primary trade lines. So I'm going to finish it off with some final statements in reference to what you need to be careful with in terms of your credit profile. So that summarizes our authorized users and primary trade line conversation. Now, I know that a lot of you guys have been buying trade lines in the past, have been accessing these authorized users in the past, and buying primary trade lines even. You always have to be careful, right? Because if you notice, the credit industry is shifting towards risk mitigation, and that means that more and more creditors are going to consider the FICO 10 model. The reason why I say that is because it's one of the most reliable metrics in terms of identifying the potential risks of a consumer when it comes to borrowing. So when you're borrowing credit or somebody else's history, you want to take that into account. And also in your personal situation with your personal credit profile, you want to take that into account. So if you do those 2 type of things and all the stuff that we discussed in this conversation, you should have tremendous success with building and establishing solid credit while preserving it from potential risks that can hurt you without you even knowing it. And especially when it comes to you spending money to get access to those tools in the first place. So if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Share this video with those that you need to help and those that you feel would benefit. If you haven't subscribed yet and you're watching this, subscribe to this channel. Turn that bell icon on so every time there's a video like this, you'll be first to be notified. Once again, this is Ali Taraftar, your guide and mentor. I'll see you guys next time. Bye for now.